Multiculturalism is a very specific doctrine that holds that all minority values must have equal status to those of the majority. Any attempt to uphold majority values over the minority is a form of prejudice. Now, that turns minorities automatically into a kind of cultural battering ram to destroy the very idea of being a majority culture at all as illegitimate and prejudiced. And so, since under this doctrine, no culture can assert itself over any other, liberalism, liberal values, cannot assert themselves as the dominant cultural force. Instead, society must fragment into a kaleidoscope of equal and opposing values. Liberal values must give way to their opposite, and the values that ultimately win are the values that are strongest. In other words, the values that are backed by the threat of violence. Now that, of course, is precisely what happened over the Mohammed cartoons. Freedom of expression, as we know, is a key liberal concept. But under multiculturalism, that key liberal value of ours cannot trump a minority faith which holds that to publish those images is to give offence which cannot be tolerated. So the minority wins over the liberal majority value, and Europeans decry not the violence and the intimidation, the kidnappings, riots and murder which followed the republication of those cartoons, but instead liberals in Britain decried the offence to minority religious feeling that was given in publishing. In other words, it was the publishers of the cartoons that were at fault, not the people who murdered people around the world because of their publication. Worse still, but allied to this, multiculturalism has simply turned our values literally upside down and inside out. It's reversed the notion of truth and lies, victim and victimizer. This is how it goes. Since minorities can do no wrong because they are oppressed by the majority and they are powerless, they cannot be held responsible for acts such as suicide bombings, and that therefore the suicide bombings must be the fault of the victims, if the victims are the majority culture. Now, this key confusion, which has caused intellectual and moral paralysis throughout the West, plays directly into pathological Muslim victim culture, which makes dialogue impossible. And this is how this goes. So many Muslims genuinely believe that they are really under attack by the West, which they think is a giant conspiracy to destroy Islam. So they represent their own aggression as legitimate self-defense, and the West's legitimate self-defense as aggression. Now, this fundamental untruth has created what I have often called a dialogue of the demented. You simply cannot have a conversation with people who turn the situation so completely upside down. It is literally like talking to a lunatic. But instead of treating it as the mad discourse that it is, and refusing to play along with it, Britain regards it merely as an extension of its own multicultural minority rights doctrine, which so the central Islamist perception, which is a mad reversal of the truth being that they, the Islamists, are attacking America and Israel, and their representation of this is that on the contrary, America and Israel are attacking them. This central Islamist perception of the big and little Satan, America and Israel, is not resisted by Britain, which tells Islamists and Muslims the truth. It is echoed in mainstream British discourse, where anti-Americanism is rampant, or indeed was rampant until the sainted one arrived in the White House, and Israel is well on the way to being delegitimized altogether. This acts catastrophically as an echo chamber for Muslim prejudice, reinforcing it and fueling the sense of paranoia and victimization. And it's also released in Britain and elsewhere the virus of Judeophobia, with claims of a world Jewish conspiracy, a rerun of medieval blood libels, leading to rising numbers of physical attacks on Jews in Britain, and now routinely represented, routinely said in our mainstream media. Our debased liberalism in these ways has thus negated the power of reason itself, the key characteristic of liberal thinking. It produces murderous prejudice and weakens the West in its defense against Islamism by paving the way for its many distortions and twisted thinking to take even deeper root. Let's take another one, the key Islamist demand that Islamist terrorism must be seen as having nothing to do with Islam, and that to link these two things is evidence of Islamophobia. Now, this is in turn another example of the jihadi tactic of using the West's own corrupted values to sow confusion and turn into a weapon against itself. And this has been achieved. The West's victim culture, the belief that all minorities are victims of the majority, and so any attempt to hold them to account is a form of prejudice, is used to label all attempts to tell the truth about Islamic violence or cultural conquest as a form of prejudice in order to silence them. And because of the dominance of victim culture and the terror of being accused of prejudice against an ethnic minority, which can lose you your job and certainly your friends, as well as the implicit threat of violence unless this demand is met, the West has caved into this. So freedom's been turned inside out. In Britain, we now have demonstrations in which the freedom of Muslims to protest on the street is protected, so they go on the streets, they're calling to behead infidels or cause death to Jews. This is tolerated by the British police as their right to free expression, but those British citizens who pass by and who are enraged by this and try and stop it are threatened themselves with arrest. So defending Western liberal values is criminalised, ironically, by a society exercising liberal, tender regard for minority rights. We've seen Geert Wilders, the leader of the Dutch Freedom Party, who defends Western freedom against Islamic violence. The Amsterdam Court of Appeals has ordered his prosecution for criticising Islam, and it was Geert Wilders who was banned by our British Home Secretary, the one who says that Islamic violence is anti-Islamic, from entering Britain for threatening public order, while she allows a procession of Islamists who preach death to Jews, destruction of Israel and defeat of the West, to come and go as they please. And this is because it is Muslims who threaten violence when hearing something that displeases them, while the authorities know that whatever violent threats or libels are thrown at the Jews, they'll never harm anyone. So it is, from that point of view, horribly true that if Geert Wilders comes in, there is more of a threat of violence than if a jihadi goes onto the streets and says, death to all Jews. There won't be any violence. It is a horrible truth. And thus, the doctrine of free speech has now been replaced in Britain by the doctrine that violence pays. But it's not just fear that's turned all this inside out. It's this overriding importance within Western society of not giving offence, which has paralysed us when we are faced with the same demand made of us by Muslims. Now, the prohibition against giving offence arises from the importance we now attach to the subjective individual and the primacy of respecting their feelings. With the rise of group rights and victim culture, the giving of offence is seen as an assault on someone's very identity, and it's therefore classed as prejudice, regardless of whether the giving offence is actually well-founded in truth. Prejudice is how it's defined, and prejudice is the crime of crimes, and so the giving of offence, regardless of the context, is criminalised as hate speech when it's a minority being offended. Now, in Britain, attempts by Muslims to criminalise as hate speech truth-telling about the jihad took the form of a law against incitement to religious hatred. This was watered down after a campaign which was driven mainly by outrage that popular comedians would no longer feel able to tell jokes on TV about religion, such as the priorities of the British public. Although it was watered down, it was still passed, and there are signs of caving in on this all over the place. A television programme, Dispatches, produced a programme called Undercover Mosque, which uncovered really very disturbing evidence indeed of incitement to murder of homosexuals, the killing of British soldiers, and hatred of unbelievers going on below the official radar in ostensibly respectable British mosques. But instead of prosecuting the fanatics who were preaching this violent stuff, the police and the prosecution authority turned on the television producers, accusing them of selective editing, distortion, and fateful crime of crimes undermining community cohesion, aka upsetting the Muslims. The police then referred the whole programme to the broadcasting watchdog, to its credit, threw it out, and the programme producers successfully sued the police for libel. But what sort of a situation we come to where telling the truth about what's going on in the mosques is criminalised, or the attempts are made to criminalise it in this way, and no action is taken against the people who are doing the incitement?